The summer heat shimmered across the desert plains surrounding Tucson, distorting the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Caroline Carter stood at her bedroom window, watching her husband Nathan mount his cavalry horse for another patrol. Their children, 6-year-old Joshua and 4-year-old Charlotte, waved enthusiastically from the porch of their modest homestead on the outskirts of the settlement. She couldn't know this ordinary morning would be the last time she'd see them alive. Nathan had warned her about increased Apache activity in the territory, but the attacks had always seemed distant, like storm clouds gathering on far horizons. The Carter family had built their life here over 3 years, cultivating a small garden and raising chickens while Nathan served as a lieutenant in the cavalry. Caroline had learned to love the harsh beauty of the desert landscape, though she still missed the gentle green hills of her childhood home in Virginia. The attack came at midday, when the sun blazed directly overhead and the world seemed to hold its breath in the crushing heat. Caroline was hanging laundry when she heard the first war cries. The chickens scattered in panic as painted warriors materialized from the scrubland, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of red dust. She ran for the children, her heart thundering against her ribs. But Joshua and Charlotte had already fled toward the barn. What followed haunted Caroline's dreams for years afterward. The terrible sounds, the acrid smoke, the desperate screams cut short. She had managed to reach the root cellar, pulling the heavy door shut just as an arrow thudded into the wood. Through gaps in the planks, she watched helplessly as flames consumed her home and everything she loved. Nathan arrived with his patrol too late, charging into an ambush that left him and his men scattered across the blood-soaked earth. Days later, a hermit trapper named Isaac Lopez found Caroline still hiding in the cellar, half mad with grief and thirst. The old man had been tracking the Apache war party and witnessed the aftermath of their raid. Instead of taking her to Tucson as she begged, Isaac convinced Caroline that the town's comfort would only soften her. "Revenge needs a hard heart," he told her, "and I can teach you how to survive long enough to find it." Isaac's cabin lay hidden in a maze of box canyons 2 days' ride from Tucson. He lived alone except for 2 pack mules and a one-eyed wolf dog he called Caleb. The cabin itself was barely more than a cave with a wooden front, but it offered shelter from both the elements and prying eyes. Here, Caroline began her transformation from cavalry officer's wife to something altogether different. Something born of grief and rage and desert dust. For 3 years, Isaac taught Caroline everything he knew about tracking, hunting, and survival. She learned to read sign in trampled grass and broken twigs, to move silently through brush, to shoot with deadly accuracy. Her soft hands grew calloused from rope and rifle, her pale skin weathered dark by sun and wind. She learned Apache words and customs from Isaac, who had once lived among them before personal tragedy drove him to isolation. Most importantly, she learned patience. The war party that destroyed her family had been led by a warrior Isaac knew as Black Knife. Through careful investigation, Caroline identified 8 other raiders who had participated in the attack. She memorized their names and faces, studying scraps of information Isaac gathered from his network of Mexican and native contacts. She tracked their movements and alliances, building a web of knowledge while honing her skills, waiting, planning, preparing. Now, 3 years to the day after the raid, Caroline sat cleaning her rifle in Isaac's cabin. Her blonde hair had been cut short for practicality, her once fashionable dresses replaced by men's clothing, adapted to her frame. The beautiful young wife who had waved goodbye to Nathan was gone, replaced by a lean, hard-eyed woman who moved like a hunting cat. Tomorrow she would begin her hunt, though Isaac's final words of warning echoed in her mind. "Revenge is a poison, Caroline. It may kill your enemies, but it will eat your soul." Through the cabin's single window, Caroline watched the sunset paint the canyon walls bloody red. She had tracked the first warrior to a small settlement near Pueblo, where he worked as a scout for the army. The irony might have made her laugh, if she remembered how. Instead, she methodically checked her weapons and supplies, mentally rehearsing the plan she had crafted over years of preparation. When darkness fell, she would begin her journey north, carrying ghosts and guns and questions about whether vengeance could ever fill the hollow spaces grief had carved inside her. The night wind whispered through the scrub brush as Caroline made her way north, her horse's hooves muffled by the soft desert sand. 3 years of training with Isaac had taught her to move silently, to become one with the harsh landscape that had claimed her family. The old trapper's lessons ran through her mind as she tracked the cooling trail, How to read the land, how to become invisible, how to wait with the patience of a mountain lion stalking its prey. The army scout who called himself Joshua now had no idea his past was catching up to him. Caroline had spent weeks observing his patterns from afar, watching him lead soldiers through the territory while maintaining his respectable facade. But she had seen his face that day at the farmstead, had memorized every detail as he and his war party turned her world to ash. The traditional medicine pouch he still wore at his belt was proof enough, the same one that had swung from his neck as he'd set fire to her home. Dawn found her concealed in the hills above Pueblo, studying the army encampment through Isaac's old brass spyglass. Joshua's routine was predictable. He would leave at first light to scout the day's patrol route. Today would be different. Today, he would ride out, but he wouldn't return. Caroline touched the small leather pouch at her throat, containing a lock of Nathan's hair and tiny wooden horse that had been Charlotte's favorite toy. The familiar ritual centered her, pushed back the doubts that sometimes crept in during the long, dark hours. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when Joshua emerged from his tent, checking his horse's tack with practiced efficiency. Caroline's fingers tightened on her rifle stock as she watched him mount up and head north along the river trail. She had chosen her ambush point carefully, a narrow canyon where the path wound between steep walls of red rock. The horse she'd stolen and killed 3 days ago still lay rotting in the sun around the bend, forcing riders to dismount and lead their mounts past the carcass. As Joshua approached the canyon, Caroline settled deeper into her hiding spot among the tumbled boulders above. The rifle's familiar weight steadied her hands as she drew a bead on the path below. This wasn't about a clean kill. She wanted him to know why he was dying, wanted to see recognition in his eyes before she sent him to whatever dark gods he served. Isaac would have counseled mercy, would have warned her again about the cost of revenge. But Isaac wasn't here, and Caroline had long since made her peace with damnation. The sound of hooves on stone echoed off the canyon walls as Joshua reached the narrow passage. His horse caught the scent of death ahead and balked, forcing him to dismount just as Caroline had planned. She watched through the rifle sight as he drew his revolver and cautiously led his mount forward, eyes scanning the cliffs above. In 3 more steps, he would round the bend and see the dead horse. In 4 steps, he would die. Caroline's finger tightened on the trigger as Joshua came into perfect position. But instead of squeezing off the shot, she called out in Apache, using the phrases Isaac had taught her. "Do you remember the woman and children you murdered near Tucson? The ones who haunted your dreams these past 3 years?" Joshua spun toward her voice, pistol raised. The recognition and fear that flooded his face told Caroline all she needed to know. Her rifle cracked once, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. As the echo faded, Caroline made her way down to where Joshua lay dying in the dust. She knelt beside him, wanting him to see her face clearly in his final moments. "There were 8 of you that day," she said softly. "You're the first. I'll find the others." His eyes widened slightly before the light faded from them. Caroline retrieved his medicine pouch and added it to her collection, the first token of her vengeance. 7 more to go. Standing over the body, Caroline felt none of the satisfaction she had imagined during countless nights of planning. Only a hollow emptiness remained, along with the burning certainty that she would not stop until every member of the war party had paid for their crimes. She mounted up and headed east, toward Wichita, where rumors placed another of her targets. Behind her, carrion birds were already circling above the canyon, drawn by the promise of death in the desert air. The late summer heat shimmered across the plains as Caroline guided her horse along the dusty trail toward Wichita. 3 years of living with the old trapper had taught her to read the land like a book. Every bent blade of grass, every disturbed patch of earth told a story. The skills that once seemed so foreign to a cavalry officer's wife now came as naturally as breathing. She touched the medicine pouch at her belt, Joshua's final possession serving as both trophy and reminder of her purpose. The distant silhouette of Wichita emerged from the heat waves like a mirage, its wooden buildings stark against the endless sky. Caroline had tracked her next target, Nathan, to this cattle town through whispered conversations in saloons and carefully planted questions among traders. He'd taken up work as a hired gun for one of the wealthy ranchers, thinking himself safe among the crowds and commerce. She would prove him wrong. Approaching the town's outskirts, Caroline noticed the tension in the air. Knots of men gathered on corners, speaking in hushed tones, while women hurried their children indoors. Something had the town spooked. Caroline Hall stood at the window of Joshua Carter's remote cabin, her rifle trained on the desert horizon as the old trapper taught her to track movement in the shifting heat waves. 3 months had passed since he'd found her wandering delirious in the Sonoran wastes, and though her body had healed, her soul remained as cracked as the parched earth. She touched the crude map drawn on deerskin where she'd marked the territories of the Apache war party that had destroyed her life. Joshua watched his unlikely student with a mix of concern and pride. In just 3 months, the cavalry officer's widow had transformed from a broken shell into a focused weapon. Her hands no longer shook when handling his prized Henry rifle, and she could read sign almost as well as he could. But the darkness in her eyes worried him. He'd seen that same haunted look in other survivors, right before vengeance consumed them entirely. The endless expanse of sand and scrub brush stretched toward Tucson, where Caroline's husband Nathan and their children had been stationed before the attack. Joshua had tried telling her that revenge was a poison that would hollow her out, but he recognized the futility of his words. Some wounds could only heal through blood, even if that healing left permanent scars. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Caroline's attention. Through Joshua's brass spyglass, she made out a small group of riders heading toward the nearby town of Pueblo. Her heart quickened as she recognized the distinctive paint patterns on their horses, the same patterns she'd memorized from that terrible day. Without a word, she began gathering her gear. Joshua grabbed her arm as she headed for the door. "You ain't ready yet," he growled. 3 months of training won't mean spit against seasoned warriors. But Caroline's steel-hard gaze told him she wouldn't be stopped. With a sigh, he released her and began packing his own saddlebags. He'd promised to teach her survival, not to watch her ride to her death. The two unlikely partners followed the war party's trail toward Pueblo, keeping to the high ground where Joshua had taught Caroline to move unseen. The old trapper's presence both reassured and frustrated her. She knew she needed his skills, but part of her feared his humanity might stay her hand when the time came for killing. The sun beat down mercilessly as they tracked their quarry. In Pueblo, they found a town preparing for siege. The local militia, led by Isaac Lopez, had spotted the Apache raiders and was hastily constructing barricades. Caroline studied the townspeople's faces, seeing the same fear she'd once worn. But now she felt only cold purpose. These raiders would not claim more innocent lives, not while she drew breath. Joshua made contact with his old friend Luke Allen, who ran the general store. Through him, they learned that the Apache band had been terrorizing settlements up and down the frontier, always staying one step ahead of the cavalry. But Luke's network of traders had noticed something odd. The raiders seemed to be searching for something specific, methodically working their way through towns. Caroline's mind raced as she absorbed this information. This wasn't random raiding. There was purpose behind their movements. She remembered her husband Nathan mentioning sensitive documents he was carrying right before the attack. Had the Apache been hired to retrieve something? The possibility that her family's murder had been more than simple violence awakened fresh rage in her heart. As night fell over Pueblo, Caroline and Joshua helped the townspeople prepare their defenses. She found herself working alongside Charlotte Nelson, a young widow whose quiet strength reminded Caroline of herself before tragedy had hardened her. Charlotte's young son Caleb trailed behind them, asking innocent questions about the approaching danger that made Caroline's chest ache with memories of her own lost children. The raiders struck just before dawn, when the desert cold was at its deepest. But Pueblo was ready. Caroline's trained eye spotted their approach long before they reached the barricades, giving the defenders precious time to take position. The first volley of Apache arrows was met with concentrated rifle fire that dropped several warriors from their mounts. Joshua proved his worth in the chaos, directing the townspeople's fire with the precision of a seasoned commander. Caroline moved like a ghost through the streets, using the skills he'd taught her to flank the attackers. She recognized the war chief who had led the raid on her family. His distinctive headdress was unmistakable, but something held her back from taking the shot. She needed answers first. The battle raged through the pre-dawn hours, with the raiders probing Pueblo's defenses from different angles. Caroline noticed they seemed most interested in the general store, confirming her suspicions about their true purpose. She shared this insight with Joshua, who relayed it to Isaac Lopez. The militia adjusted their defense to protect that position more heavily. A turning point came when Charlotte Nelson proved her own courage, using her knowledge of the town's adobe architecture to help defenders move unseen between buildings through old Spanish tunnels. The Apache, expecting easy prey, found themselves caught in a carefully planned crossfire. Their losses mounted as the sun rose over the desert, painting the scene in shades of blood and gold. The war chief finally called a retreat, but Caroline knew this was only the beginning. She had seen the calculating look in his eyes. He would return with more warriors. But she had also seen something else. Recognition. When their eyes met across the gun smoke, she knew he remembered her. The hunt was truly on now, and both predator and prey knew the stakes. Joshua found her after the battle, cleaning her rifle with mechanical precision. "You had the shot," he said quietly. "Why didn't you take it?" Caroline's hands never stopped their methodical movement as she replied, "Because death's too quick for them. I want answers first. Then they'll die slow like my family did." Joshua nodded grimly, understanding that his student had evolved into something beyond his teaching. The desert wind carried whispers of the Apache war party's movements across the territory. Caroline and Joshua spent the next days fortifying their position while gathering intelligence from friendly Pueblo traders who passed through. The natives spoke of increased activity near Durango, where the war chief had been seen conferring with other bands. Caroline meticulously mapped each reported sighting, seeing a pattern emerge that told her more than just their locations. It revealed their strategy. In the cool of dawn, she tracked fresh signs leading west toward an ancient riverbed. Joshua had taught her to read the land like a book, and now every broken twig and disturbed pebble told its story. The tracks showed 15 riders, moving fast but heavy with supplies. They were gathering strength, preparing for something bigger than their failed raid. The thought made her fingers tighten around her rifle's worn stock, the wood smooth from years of similar grips. The midday sun found her perched on a high ridge overlooking a narrow canyon, watching through her spyglass as 3 Apache scouts surveyed the area below. Their movements suggested they were mapping routes through the complex terrain, likely planning escape paths for a larger force. Caroline noted each detail in the small leather journal she'd carried since her days as an officer's wife, though its pages now held death warrants instead of social engagements. Joshua caught up with her as evening approached, his mule loaded with supplies from Pueblo. "Town's buzzing with news," he said, settling beside her observation post. 3 ranches hit north of Tucson. They're pushing settlers into the larger settlements, making it easier to concentrate their attacks. Caroline nodded, adding this information to her growing mental map of the enemy's movements. The war chief was smarter than most gave him credit for. He was orchestrating something elaborate. The night brought cool relief from the day's heat, but sleep eluded Caroline. She sat cleaning her weapons by lamplight in the small adobe structure they'd claimed as their base, each mechanical action a meditation on purpose. Joshua watched her from across the room, noting how the flickering light cast shadows that made her look more spirit than human. "You're becoming something new," he observed quietly. "Just make sure you recognize yourself when this is done." Dawn painted the eastern sky with promises of another scorching day, as Caroline and Joshua rode toward a remote waterhole where Apache raiders had been spotted. The desert stretched endless around them, its harsh beauty a reminder of nature's indifference to human concerns. A dust devil danced across their path, and Caroline remembered her daughter Charlotte's laughter at such sights before the memory turned to ash like everything else from that life. The waterhole revealed signs of recent activity. Not just Apache, but white men too. Joshua found cartridge casings that matched Army issue, though no military patrols were scheduled in this area. "Deserters," he concluded, studying the signs, "probably selling weapons to the war party." Caroline's expression hardened. These men were now part of her hunt, their betrayal adding new names to her mental list of debts to be paid. As they followed the trails leading from the waterhole, Caroline spotted something that made her blood run cold. A distinctive mark carved into a sun-bleached tree trunk. It was the same symbol she'd seen painted on the war chief's shield during the attack that destroyed her family. He was taunting her, letting her know he remembered too. The hunt had become a dance between 2 predators, each aware of the other's presence, waiting to see who would make the first fatal mistake. Joshua read the growing tension in his companion's posture. 3 years of training had turned Caroline from a grieving widow into a deadly force. But revenge was a poison that could corrupt even the strongest spirit. He'd seen it before in others who'd walked this path. Some found their peace in vengeance, others lost themselves completely. Looking at Caroline's face as she studied the carved symbol, he wondered which fate awaited her. The sun was setting when they made camp in a defensible position among the rocks. Caroline took first watch, her rifle across her lap as she gazed out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, the war chief was planning his next move. She would be ready, but Joshua's earlier words echoed in her mind. Would there be anything left of Caroline the cavalry officer's wife once Caroline the Avenger finished her work? The desert offered no answers, only the whisper of wind through ancient stones. The desert winds howled through Pueblo's empty streets as Caroline Carter crouched behind an overturned wagon, her Winchester rifle trained on the northwestern approach. 3 years of tracking Apache warriors across the territories had honed her instincts to a razor's edge. The settlement's remaining defenders, barely 24 souls, had positioned themselves among the buildings according to her battle plan. She'd learned strategy from old Nathan Hall, the hermit trapper who'd saved her life and taught her to survive after that blood-soaked day when she lost everything. The Apache war party led by the ruthless warrior she knew only as Black Knife had been systematically raiding settlements, growing bolder with each attack. Caroline had tracked them for months, picking off isolated members of the band one by one, but now they'd gathered reinforcements for something bigger. Pueblo's citizens had initially dismissed her warnings, but when scouts reported a large force approaching, they'd turned to her desperately for help. She'd organized their defenses, knowing this was her chance to finally confront the man who'd murdered her family. Beside her, Joshua Lopez checked his ammunition for the third time, his young face etched with determination. He'd lost his mother to a previous raid, and Caroline recognized in him the same burning need for vengeance that had driven her these past years. But she'd also learned from Nathan that revenge was a poison that could hollow out your soul. The old trapper's wisdom echoed in her mind. Justice ain't the same as vengeance, girl. One heals, t'other just makes more wounds. The first arrows whistled through the air as mounted warriors emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, their war cries shattering the morning silence. Caroline's rifle cracked, dropping the lead rider. She'd positioned sharpshooters in the church tower and atop the mercantile, creating overlapping fields of fire. The Apache warriors were fearsome fighters, but they'd never faced a defense planned by someone who'd studied their tactics for years. The first wave broke against the town's prepared positions like water on rocks. In the chaos of battle, Caroline spotted Black Knife directing his warriors from horseback, his distinctive ceremonial shield marking him clearly. She'd dreamed of this moment countless times during lonely nights in Nathan's cabin, learning to read sign and shoot straight while snow howled outside. But now, with her target finally in sight, she hesitated. Nathan's last words before dying of fever 6 months ago had been about forgiveness, about breaking cycles of violence. Her finger trembled on the trigger. The battle shifted as the Apache warriors adopted new tactics, using fire arrows to create diversions. Caroline shouted orders, coordinating the defenders' responses. Joshua proved himself invaluable, running messages between positions while dodging arrows. The town's water tower exploded in a shower of planks and spray as a burning arrow found its mark. But the backup wells Caroline had insisted on digging meant the defenders could still fight the fires. Black Knife led a charge down the main street, warriors firing arrows from horseback. Caroline's carefully positioned sharpshooters took a deadly toll, but the Apache leader seemed protected by supernatural fortune. A bullet creased his shoulder but didn't stop him. He locked eyes with Caroline across the chaos, recognition flickering in his gaze. She realized he remembered her from that day 3 years ago, the day he'd taken everything from her. The fighting intensified as the sun climbed higher, the desert heat becoming another enemy. Caroline had anticipated this, establishing water stations throughout the defensive positions. She'd learned desert warfare the hard way, tracking the Apache through burning canyons and across sun-blasted mesas. Black Knife's warriors were masters of this environment, but so was she now. The tide began to turn as the attackers' losses mounted. In a moment that seemed ordained by fate, Caroline found herself face-to-face with Black Knife in a quiet side street away from the main battle. He'd lost his horse and shield, but still moved with deadly grace, knife in hand. She leveled her rifle at his chest, finger tightening on the trigger. Then she saw something in his eyes. Not hatred or bloodlust, but a deep weariness. The same emptiness she saw in her own reflection every morning. "Your people killed mine," she said in his language, the Apache words Nathan had taught her feeling strange on her tongue. "My husband. My children." Black Knife nodded slowly, speaking of his own losses to white settlers, of raids that had taken his family, of a cycle of violence that seemed endless. Caroline's rifle barrel wavered as she realized that pulling the trigger wouldn't bring her family back. It would only continue the spiral of death that had claimed so many on both sides. The moment stretched like heated glass, ready to shatter. Then Caroline slowly lowered her rifle. "It ends here," she said, switching back to English. "Right away. Tell your people Pueblo is protected now. There's been enough killing." Black Knife studied her face for a long moment, then inclined his head in acknowledgement. Within an hour, the remaining Apache warriors had withdrawn, leaving their dead behind. The town was saved, but Caroline felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that Nathan would have approved of her choice. As the townspeople emerged to assess the damage and tend to their wounded, Joshua approached Caroline with questions in his eyes. She holstered her rifle and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest battle," she said softly, "is choosing not to fight." He didn't understand yet, but she saw a glimmer of comprehension in his expression. Perhaps there was hope for breaking the cycle after all. The desert wind carried away the smoke of battle, and Caroline Carter felt the weight of vengeance finally lift from her shoulders. In the days following the battle, Caroline found herself drawn to the quiet corners of Pueblo, seeking solitude as she processed her decision to spare Black Knife. The townsfolk celebrated their victory, but she remained apart, watching from shadows as they rebuilt damaged structures and strengthened their defenses. The desert winds carried whispers of change, both in the town and within her own heart. Joshua had taken to following her at a respectful distance, like a wary coyote studying a mysterious new creature in his territory. She recognized in him the same burning need for vengeance that had once consumed her, having lost his father to Apache raids the previous spring. One evening, as the setting sun painted the adobe walls in shades of amber, he finally gathered the courage to approach her directly. "You could have ended him," Joshua said, his young voice crackling with barely contained emotion. "Black Knife was right there in your sights, after everything they've done." Caroline turned to face him, seeing reflected in his eyes the same raw pain she'd carried for 3 years. The weight of Nathan's wedding ring, still hanging from a leather cord around her neck, seemed heavier than usual. "When I first set out on this path," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I thought revenge would fill the hollow places inside me. Each warrior I tracked down, each life I took, I was certain it would bring me closer to peace. But with every death, the emptiness only grew deeper." She touched the rough adobe wall beside her, feeling its sun-warmed surface. "Like this wall, Joshua. You can't build something lasting on a foundation of hatred." The town's success in repelling the raid had drawn attention from neighboring settlements. A delegation arrived from Durango seeking Caroline's help in training their own defenders. She found herself torn between the urge to move on, as she had always done, and an unexpected desire to put down roots. The people of Pueblo had begun to feel like more than just faces in another town. They were becoming family. Eleanor, the widow who ran the general store, had taken to leaving food on Caroline's doorstep, while Rose, the schoolteacher, offered her a position teaching the older children about tracking and survival. These simple gestures of acceptance touched something in Caroline that she'd thought long dead. The hermit trapper who had taught her had always warned that civilization would feel like a trap after the freedom of the wilderness. But instead, she found it oddly comforting. One morning, as Caroline demonstrated proper rifle maintenance to a group of townswomen, she caught sight of a familiar figure on the outskirts of town. The old trapper himself, appearing like a mirage from her past, leaned against a hitching post watching her with quiet amusement. After dismissing her students, she approached him, noting the new lines carved into his weathered face. "Never thought I'd see you playing school, marm," he said, his gruff voice softened by affection. "Seems you found something worth protecting after all." Caroline smiled, realizing he had known all along that her healing would come not from revenge, but from helping others protect what she had lost. The lessons he had taught her about survival had really been about living. As summer faded into autumn, Caroline made her decision. She would stay in Pueblo, helping to train not just defenders but teachers of defense, creating a network of prepared communities across the territory. The skills she had learned for vengeance would now serve life instead of death. Joshua had become her first true student, his anger slowly transforming into purposeful dedication as she taught him to protect rather than destroy. The last of the Apache war party that had killed her family remained out there somewhere, but Caroline no longer felt driven to hunt them down. She had found a different kind of justice in ensuring that other families would not suffer as she had. Nathan would have understood. He had always believed in building rather than breaking, in creating rather than destroying. One evening, as she stood watching the sunset paint the desert in fierce colors, Caroline finally removed the wedding ring from its cord. She buried it beneath a young cottonwood tree on the edge of town, marking not an ending but a transformation. The woman who had emerged from 3 years of wilderness training was neither the cavalry officer's wife she had been, nor the vengeful hunter she had become. She was something new, something stronger, forged in the fire of loss, but tempered by the choice to protect rather than avenge. Caroline Carter gazed at the sun-bleached walls of Durango as wagons rolled into town laden with supplies and worried families. 3 years of tracking her husband's killers had led to this moment. The Apache war party that had destroyed her life was gathering in the hills, preparing to raid the settlement. But this time, she wasn't their prey, she was their hunter. Nathan Hall, the grizzled trapper who had taught her survival and marksmanship during those years in isolation, stood beside her on the weathered boardwalk. His once strange habits now felt familiar as breathing. "They won't expect a woman to lead the defense," he muttered, checking the sight on his Sharps rifle. "That's our advantage." The town council had initially dismissed Caroline's warnings, but Joshua Lopez, the local blacksmith who'd lost his own family to raiders years before, had vouched for her skills. Now the entire settlement was mobilizing under her direction, transforming the dusty streets into a carefully planned killing ground. Eleanor Nelson, the schoolteacher, had organized the women into teams, stockpiling water and medical supplies in the stone church. Caroline watched them work with a mix of pride and sorrow, remembering how she'd once been as innocent as they were, before violence had reshaped her into something harder than the desert itself. Luke Allen, the youngest of her remaining targets, had been spotted among the war party. He'd been the one to torch her home while her children slept. Caroline touched the scarred skin beneath her collar, a reminder of her desperate attempt to save them. The time for mercy had long since passed, burned away like morning dew under the merciless sun. Isaac Carter, no relation but bearing her husband's surname, commanded the hastily assembled militia. He'd seen enough of Caroline's deadly accuracy with a rifle to know she wasn't exaggerating the threat. Together, they positioned sharpshooters on the rooftops, turning Durango's humble buildings into a fortress. The waiting was the hardest part. Caroline paced the upper floor of the general store, watching heat shimmer above the distant rocks. Nathan had taught her patience, shown her how to read sign and track prey across impossible terrain. But revenge was a different kind of hunting. It consumed the hunter as much as the hunted. When the attack came, it was like nothing the Apache had encountered before. Caroline's intimate knowledge of their tactics, learned through years of observation and pursuit, turned their own strategies against them. The first wave broke against walls of coordinated rifle fire, forcing them to fall back in disarray. Luke Allen died trying to flank the church, picked off by Caroline's rifle before he could reach the women and children sheltering inside. She felt no satisfaction as he fell, only a hollow echo where vengeance should have been. The desert wind carried away his final breath, adding another ghost to her collection. Through the smoke and chaos, Caroline spotted Caleb Carter, the war party's leader and the man who'd given the order that destroyed her family. He was more gray now, face weathered by years of sun and violence, but she'd never forget those eyes. They locked gazes across the battlefield, recognition flickering between hunter and prey. The final confrontation wasn't the dramatic duel she'd imagined during countless nights under the stars. Instead, it was quick and brutal, decided by skills learned in the harshest school imaginable. Caleb's surprise at finding himself outmatched by a woman he'd once left for dead was the last expression to cross his face. As the surviving raiders retreated into the hills, Caroline stood among the defenders of Durango, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders. The town had been saved, her vengeance complete, but the hollow place inside her remained. Nathan appeared at her side, silent as always, offering not consolation but understanding. Eleanor approached cautiously, leading a group of children who'd been protected in the church. One small girl broke away, running to hug Caroline's legs in gratitude. The simple gesture cracked something in her heart, letting light into places that had been dark for too long. Perhaps there were better ways to honor the dead than by adding to their number. Joshua Lopez found her later, as she watched the sun set from the church steps. He didn't speak of revenge or justice, only offered her a position training the town's defenders. "We need someone who understands both sides of survival," he said. "Someone who can teach others to protect what matters without losing themselves." Caroline considered the offer as darkness crept across the desert. The skills she'd learned hunting killers could serve a different purpose now. Nathan nodded approvingly from the shadows, his own lonely path having led him to find meaning in teaching rather than vengeance. The horizon stretched endless before her, promising not peace perhaps, but possibility. Years of tracking had taught Caroline to read signs in the smallest details: a bent blade of grass, a displaced stone, the pattern of dust on the wind. Now she saw signs of a different kind. Children playing without fear, women walking proud and capable, men learning to respect rather than dismiss her leadership. These were tracks that led toward healing rather than harm. As night fell over Durango, Caroline made her decision. She would stay, build something new from the ashes of her past. The desert had taught her that life could flourish in the harshest places, that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victory was choosing to lay down arms and plant seeds instead. Nathan departed the next morning, leaving her his old Sharps rifle and a lifetime of lessons. The town gathered to bid him farewell, understanding now what Caroline had learned during those 3 years in his company. That wisdom often came wrapped in strange packages, and that transformation required both destruction and nurture. Caroline took up residence in a small house on the edge of town, close enough to help, but far enough to hear the desert's voice when she needed guidance. She hung her husband's photo beside her new teaching credentials, letting the past and future coexist rather than conflict. The woman who had emerged from tragedy was neither victim nor avenger, but something altogether new. As spring turned to summer, Caroline found her rhythm teaching at the schoolhouse she helped establish on the outskirts of Pueblo. The children's laughter gradually replaced the echoes of gunfire that had haunted her dreams, though she never fully forgot the weight of the Sharps rifle mounted above her fireplace. A reminder of both violence and redemption, word spread through the territory of the schoolteacher who could outshoot most men, and her presence alone deterred those who might have considered the growing settlement an easy target. She taught more than reading and arithmetic. Her students learned about the desert's harsh beauty, its hidden springs and healing plants, knowledge passed down from Nathan that she now wove into lessons about survival and respect for the land. One autumn morning, a rider brought news that shook her carefully constructed peace. Joshua, the last surviving member of the war party she'd once hunted, had been spotted near Durango. The old familiar fire flickered in her chest, but it no longer consumed her. She watched her students playing in the schoolyard, their futures bright with possibility, and knew she had found a different kind of justice. Eleanor, one of her oldest students, noticed her teacher's distant gaze and brought her a wild desert flower. The girl's simple gesture reminded Caroline of Rose, her lost daughter, but the memory now carried sweetness along with its sting. She pressed the flower between the pages of her Bible, alongside the dried blooms from each year since she'd chosen to lay down her vengeance. The town grew steadily, attracting families seeking new beginnings. Caroline helped establish a library, filling it with books about the territory's history, native peoples, and the delicate balance of desert life. She wrote her own accounts too, not just of violence and revenge, but of transformation and the courage to choose a different path. Nathan visited occasionally, his presence a quiet affirmation of her choices. They would sit on her porch in the evening, watching the sun paint the desert in impossible colors, speaking of simple things: the year's rainfall, the wild horse herds, the progress of her students. His weathered face would crease with pride when townspeople stopped to greet Miss Caroline with genuine respect and affection. Years passed, and Caroline's story became part of the territory's lore, though not as the tale of a vengeful widow. Instead, they spoke of the schoolteacher who helped bridge worlds, who taught both letters and survival, who understood that true strength lay in knowing when to holster a gun and extend a hand instead. The Apache who had once been her enemies began bringing their children to learn at her school, recognizing in her someone who had walked through darkness and emerged with wisdom rather than hatred. She learned their language, their stories, and found that healing could flow both ways across old battle lines. One winter evening, as she added another pressed flower to her Bible, Caroline found the worn photograph of her husband and children. Their faces no longer brought the searing pain of loss, but rather a gentle reminder of love's endurance. She had built something lasting from their memory, not a monument to vengeance, but a legacy of education and understanding that would outlive any bullet. The desert around Pueblo bloomed after rare spring rains, and Caroline took her students to see the transformation. As they marveled at flowers pushing through sun-baked earth, she shared Nathan's teaching about nature's resilience. Life, like the desert, found ways to persist and beautify even the harshest landscapes. Her own heart had proven equally resilient, capable of flowering again after devastating loss. In time, younger teachers came to learn from her, and Caroline's influence spread throughout the territory. The school grew into an academy, drawing students from as far as Tucson and Wichita. Each graduate carried forward her unique blend of practical wisdom and book learning, understanding that true education encompassed both survival skills and spiritual growth. As she aged, Caroline's hair turned silver like the desert sage, and her reputation grew into something approaching legend. But those who knew her best understood that her real strength lay not in the accuracy of her aim, or the notches once carved in her rifle stock, but in her decision to transform vengeance into something that nourished rather than destroyed.